Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Next week, we'll hear from Bill Blunden. You will have the opportunity to meet somebody who is a world-class expert on rootkits. If you don't know what rootkits are, you can look it up and convince yourself that it's probably something worth your while to learn. That's next week. Today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Cheryl MacDonald from Vertigo, who promised, kind of like Men in Black, to denerdify all of us. Let's welcome our speaker.
Hey guys. So we're waiting for the PowerPoint. My name is Cheryl MacDonald. I'm a creative developer. Sure. I'll write it on. Well, I guess you can see everybody. Okay, everyone got my name? You cool?
Yeah.
Sweet. Alright. So, once again, my name is Cheryl. I'm a creative developer or front-end engineer at Vertigo. And Vertigo is a software company based in Point Richmond over in the East Bay. And we do sort of contract for hire software that's mostly focused around media apps. So we make media apps, and we kind of work in small teams, kind of clump together to get these apps out the door. So it's sort of like a startup feel, because you're with your own little crew, and it's not the same crew every project, but it's sort of within a larger company organization. So it's a really neat experience, and we are technically consultants, if that's the buzzword you need for figuring out what, if you were looking for a job, what kind of environment that would be. So I'm going to start talking about what a front-end engineer does. So front-end engineers sit between design and development. So we're kind of the overlap in the Venn diagram. And we make the software look like it's supposed to. So we take the way the software is supposed to work from the developers, and we take the designs that the designers produce, and we kind of mash them up, right? So we make things pixel perfect and make things, again, look the way they're supposed to. But there's a lot of design work that kind of goes in on the back end. And I feel like as developers, and future developers, it's a little hard sometimes to kind of look at the other side of the fence. So that's what my talk is about, is all of that stuff that goes into design and how you can incorporate that into your software, which I'm sure you're developing. So when I'm talking about the front end is the part the user interacts with. So you might notice that there is no major in front-end engineering. It's been kind of a really niche job title up until recently. A lot of us front-end engineers came from like the web development and web design world and translated our skills over to software. So not a whole lot of us, but the number is growing. So if mashing up art and engineering is something you're interested in, that might be a career field to look into. What is a designer? So as nerds, we kind of lump designers into this other category, right? Like, not us. We know a PHP developer from a Java developer, and there's a lot of sort of engineering hierarchy that we know about. but we don't talk about designers too often. So designers come in several flavors. First flavor is user experience designers. And user experience designers are the ones that make sure that the software does what it needs to do, and it works the way the client, in our case, or the company, if you're working in a product shop, specifies. Next type of designer, user interface designers. So they make it look like it should. So they're the ones that apply, the blue to the buttons and the gradients to the background and that kind of thing. So they usually come from more of like an art or a visual design background. And lastly, we have information architects, which don't tend to be their own kind of designers unless you're working in a really big company. So that usually falls into kind of the category of the above two. An information architect creates a framework for relaying this information to the user, right? So it's kind of the same way that like an architect, if you're building a house, designs hallways so you can easily get to all the rooms that you need to. An information architect makes it so everything is laid out so you can get to whatever you need easily as a user. And many more. There's always a ton of different design tasks at a big product company. So you could have like someone who's into branding and make sure that the app looks the way your brand intends. Or, I don't know, there are some people who specialize in typography, right? So it can get pretty niche. But these are kind of the big buckets. So how does a designer think? Designers are about the feels, right? So they tend to employ the soft skills. They're the ones that have to talk to all these different product owners and figure out what kind of feeling they want to convey with the product, right? So if we were making an app where you can buy a pizza with one click of a button on your phone, you would want something that makes you feel hungry or makes you feel pizza, right? You wouldn't want to give it the same kind of layout as if you had an app where with one click of a button you could order Mexican food, right? Because those aren't really the same feeling necessarily. But that's all it's all very subjective, right? So these aren't hard skills. Like you can't, run an algorithm to figure out what pizza feels like. It's just sort of a thing that you have to intuit. So like I said, they need to gather all kinds of information about the brand, the client, like what their business goals are. Like if you want to sell as many pizzas as possible, you would probably want a slightly different layout than if you wanted to sell, fewer very expensive pizzas, per se. You need to convey information about your brand, if that's important to you. The app could be your brand, so it's not always that important. And the content. Design is way more abstract than development. So this oatmeal cartoon, at the top we see sort of a developer client interaction, where the client has very specific needs about what they want. And then at the bottom, that's more of the client designer interaction, where you need to capture the essence of ocean waves crashing upon a squishy glowing heart, which again, you can't really run an algorithm for. So what does a designer do on a daily basis? Well, there are a few steps. We'll go over these a little bit later and figure out how you can incorporate them into your software. But the steps start with wireframes, go into kind of high-def wireframes, so you start fleshing out your wireframes. We'll talk about all these terms later. If you're lost, then that's totally fine. Go into visuals or comps, and then finally, code. So the first three can be the same person, or the same team, or different people, or different agencies working together. all look like this. They little berets. It's very cute. And then code, that's where the developers come in. But you need that. Developer code. So the thing is to not restrict yourself to either design or development. You can exist on a range, right? If you're a developer, you still have input in design. This isn't like a brick wall between teams. So whatever abilities you bring to the table, great. If you took an art class and you really know your stuff about Renaissance painting, that absolutely has a place in the design team, even if you're a developer. So step one, back to that slide. This is how we as designers conceptualize the design part of software. So we like to start with a concept and an app map. The first thing you need to answer when you're thinking about your concept or your app map is, what does your software do? It seems kind of silly, but a lot of people kind of overlook this, right? You say you need an app for golf, then people can start, getting really excited and just sort of running off on this sprint about golf, but they never actually like hone in on what their objectives are as far as designing software. What platforms does it work on? Same thing. If you have to do Android development and iOS development, that's a whole different ballgame than just doing like a responsive website. So what are your platform requirements? And does it need to be responsive? This is more kind of for web, but increasingly for mobile, right? With all the different screen sizes that are coming out now and the iPhone 6 XL or whatever it's called. How can you hone in your design to be responsive and to fit on all the different devices that a user expects it to fit on, right? Because you don't want to just design for the smallest iPhone, excuse me, and then have a terrible surprise later on when you try to run it on a larger iPhone and it just doesn't work. Also, how are you expecting it to work? As designers and developers, you have to kind of sync up at some point and figure out if each team is expecting it to work differently or the same. Again, this seems silly, but this happens way more often than I care to talk about. And does it use stock elements, or do they need to be custom? So if you're making a new, Snapchat kind of clone, is it going to use the default iOS or Android camera roll, or is it going to use something new that you got to spin up, right? Because that all has a big development impact down the line. So app maps. You've seen this term at the top of my slide. I don't know if you've heard it sort of in the wild, but an app map is literally where you just draw rectangles with the lines to other rectangles to show the order in which a user would access different pages. So those are used to chart out what the key screens are and how you get to them and how you get back from them. App maps are used to help both design and dev conceptualize what needs to go into the app, right? Because sometimes you completely forget that you need like a search results page. Like, you need search, but you totally forget search results. So that's where an app map would come in handy to remind you that you need search results. And it can be whatever. Like, draw some rectangles on a napkin, scan it in. That's totally valid. Like, this isn't prescriptive, The point of this is just to do what works for you. So one of my favorite wireframing tools is like the little draw application that comes stock on PCs, right? MS Paint. That's a great one. Or, again, drawn on the back of whatever notes I have from other meetings, that kind of stuff. Case in point, this is an app map that I've done. It's literally just rough sketches. Totally fine. Step 2 are wireframes. So once you have your app map completed and you've identified all the parts that go into your app and roughly how everything's going to flow, you can start making wireframes. And wireframes are just kind of linear sketches of roughly how you want things to be laid out on a page. So sort of like this image over here. There's no assets. It's just big gray box. That's an image. And then some random text. That's the text. So the point of doing a wireframe is to get your information architecture roughly in place so you don't have to sort of battle that dragon later on. So let's talk a little bit about how you do a wireframe. So it's Tetris, right? You have these blocks. You have these blocks that are assets, and you have a gallery, right? How do you arrange all these different asset blocks so the gallery looks the way you want it to be? So you finally gotta bring your Tetris skills into real life. Information architecture. We used that in the last couple slides. That's how you group stuff together in an app. It can be grouped according to function. So if you were to write a new drawing app, you would probably want to put all of your paintbrushes and pencils and line drawing stuff kind of roughly in the same place. And then all the color palette things also roughly in the same place, because that's what makes sense. You don't want kind of colors and drawing implements and whatever just mashed up together, because that doesn't make sense. So that's how you group it for function. Visibility. Like a newspaper, the important stuff goes to the top. So when you get a newspaper and it's folded, right, the biggest headline, the thing that's going to sell you the paper, is big and bold text, and it's at the top, because that's the first thing your eye goes to. You want the same thing to be happening in your software, because you want people to interact with your app. And if it's just a bunch of boring crap, they're probably not going to interact with your app. If it's like a wall of text at the top, it's not enticing to a user. So, this example, amazing paperboy delivers. That's the most important part of that. But then there's other, earns honors, big bucks, slightly less important. So it's slightly less bold, a little bit further down. You can also group according to utility to the user. So there's, flyout menus that kind of slide in from the side, especially on phone apps. I'm sure you've all seen them. Those all should be grouped together according to utility. That isn't necessarily the same as function, because they don't all do similar things, but the utility in a menu is its own form of that architecture. The point of this is group things that are alike together. Also, make sure it's easy to get from one thing to the next. So if you're making an app on a phone and the phone is a phablet, so you can't really reach to the middle with your thumbs, don't put buttons that the users need to use all the time in the middle, because it's harder to reach. You would want to kind of push those to the outside edges so it's a little easier to get to. Also, you would use different nav structures, right? Like if you're on one item and you need to go to the next item, you would group that with the part of the structure that shows you where you are, right? Like the Amazon checkout, breadcrumbs, shopping cart thing, where it says cart, payment, checkout. Those are all kind of grouped together. I'm sure you've all seen Amazon. The other thing is put a grid on it. So just like in Tetris, everything aligns to a grid. It's not just like a bunch of crazy crap scattered all over the page. It doesn't look like Legos that went through a washing machine, right? Everything gets stacked together. I know you're good at Tetris, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Also, again, back to the responsiveness thing, which is increasingly important now. You know, this isn't a buzzword we would have heard 5 years ago, probably. It's very modern. If your software needs to be responsive, this is the point at which you sketch out all of the ideas for all of your different screens. Don't leave that to the last minute, because that's just a headache. So if you do need something to grow or shrink, have a plan for that. And this is the stage at which to plan. So this is an example of kind of a grid system. So on the monitor, you can see that that's a 12-column grid. And we're implying that this is the same piece of software that works across all these different devices. So we have, looks like a tablet, and then a phablet, and then a phone. A phablet, by the way, is somewhere between a tablet and a phone, in case someone hasn't heard that. So you have the 12-column grid on the desktop, and that could shrink down to 4 columns on the tablet, 2 columns on a phablet, and then 1 column on the phone. So that's roughly the structure. Don't think that you need to squeeze all 12 columns on a tiny little phone, because that's just impossible. So keep an eye for that in your designs. So step 3 is comps. Comp, if you hear that term floating around, is short for comprehensive design. So that's usually what we call like a pixel perfect or a visual or something like that. These all kind of go by different names, but it's the same general idea. That's where a designer or a developer or whoever is designing the app, let's not draw boxes around people, lays stuff out in a pixel perfect fashion. And usually the tool for the trade in this is Photoshop, but some shops use like GIMP, or some shops use other tools, but all roughly the same general idea. So just some kind of design tool that allows you to put all the stuff that you want in your app. And again, it could be paint. A comp contains colors, typography, and branding, whereas the wireframe in the last step doesn't necessarily. The wireframes in the last step are usually black and white, but again, they don't have to be. Whatever works for you is the right thing to do. But comps, typically, colors, typography, branding. And they try to emulate the look and feel of the final product, right? So this is where someone like me, as a front-end developer, front-end engineer kind of person, would take what the developers have built for the back end and what the designers have made as far as, you know, pixel perfect designs go, and match them up. So this is where I'd start, you know, using a ruler and seeing how wide different elements on the screen are, and then implementing that in code. So there are important aspects to design, which we'll go over quickly. So typefaces, they come in 2 types usually. I mean, there's a whole lot of other types, but just for our purposes right now, there's serif and sans serif. Serif typefaces are like this, which I think is Katami. And they have the fancy little decorations at the end. Like you can see there's like a little something right there on the F that this F, which is sans serif, doesn't have. And my cats will demonstrate. This is probably a little hard to read, sorry guys. But designers would call it a typeface, whereas developers would call it a font. And there's a lot of distinctions between the actual terms, but for now, we can use those interchangeably. It's cool. So my trick for getting good-looking typography without a whole lot of effort or years at design school is you choose one for the header, one for the body. Right? So find one with little fancy curly cues and find one without fancy curly cues and make one of each. The general wisdom for that is that sans serif, so those are the ones without the curly cues, they're easier to read at bigger sizes. So like in this presentation, for example, I'm using a lot of 28-point font, and sans serif text is probably easier to read because it's bigger. But if I were to make walls and walls of text, like a textbook, I'd probably use a serif typeface. And that's just, part of it's cultural, because we grow up reading a lot of books that are printed in serif font, so it's a little more natural for us to go through and read. And part of it's just that it's easier to distinguish serif font or serif letters from each other. There's a little bit less symmetry. So kerning, it's another fancy design term. Kerning is the space between letters. Developers call it kerning. Or sorry, designers call it kerning. Developers call it letter spacing. Again, same general idea. Just the space between letters in a page. So usually a pixel or two at the outside. Bad kerning, it makes it look like two letters have been mashed together. So there's a new term for this called kemming, because the R and the N, if you have the word kern badly kerned, look like they make an M. So I found that funny. If you have bad kerning, you often get hilarious consequences. So when
oh, it's supposed to be flicks.
Yeah.
So if you have a word that needs to be kerned really well, like if you're making a logo or something like that, one of my tricks is to flip the entire word upside down and then look at the kerning, just because it's really just shapes. It's making sure shapes are evenly squeezed together. But our brain interprets them as something different than shapes, right? So if kerning is important to you, that's just a little trick. Does anyone need me to explain this? Are we good? And leading, not leading, leading. It's the space between lines of text. That leading is the design term. Developers would call it line height, right, in CSS or other declarative languages. Good leading makes a block of text easier to read, right? Because if you have all of the lines of text kind of butting up against each other, your eye doesn't know where to go. It makes kind of weird rivers of white space. It's hard to describe, but just try it sometime and you'll see what I mean. Like all the spaces between words make weird patterns. It's very distracting. And if you have bad leading, the eye can't figure out where it needs to go next. So it helps you keep track of where you are in a big block of text. Colors, everyone's favorite. Keep it simple. This thing is a color wheel. If you've taken art classes, you may have seen it, or hopefully you've seen it in previous experience. Don't try to use all of them. That's what I mean by keep it simple. Like, figure out a couple maybe that you want to use, and don't go crazy. You get black, white, and gray for free when you're doing interfaces. So use those to your heart's content. Usually the fewer colors the better, unless you really know what you're doing or you have like a good vision or some kind of actual branding requirement. Keep it simple again. black, white, and gray. Go nuts. And don't use stoplight colors. So don't make all of your buttons green, because green says to us, go, right? So that's what we call like the happy path, right? Where everything is going smoothly and you just want to keep going from one step to another. If you have a button that says, oh no, you screwed up, I'm going to take you back to this other app, and it's green, that's kind of a weird experience for the user. So if you have a button that does say, you screwed up, I'm going to take you back, that would probably be red, because that's the color we associate with bad or stop. So again, don't make your entire interface red or green unless you really have a pretty good vision for where that's going to go. And then keep improving. Don't be too hard on yourself. Design, just like development, takes a lot of practice. And if you screw something up, figure out why. You can ask your parents or other people in class or someone randomly on campus, like what they find objectionable about the interface you've designed. And getting feedback in that way is probably one of the best teaching tools. Because again, this isn't a hard and fast science. I mean, there's a couple of guidelines like the stoplight rule, but just sort of getting personal feedback from folks is very valuable in determining what needs to be improved and what can make an interface more friendly to the user. It doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be something that a marketing firm gathers. It can just be, again, some random person at a table next to yours at the library or something like that, telling you that they don't like your color blue, especially with the red text on top. That doesn't work out too well. And don't sweat it. If you can't get it in, you can't get it in. The next version, that's the time. Right? Any software is better than no software. So don't let this hold you back from achieving your goals of actually launching software. Okay, don't expect perfection. Doesn't have to be pixel perfect. These are all just kind of guidelines. Whatever works for you, use whatever tools you feel comfortable with. Those are kind of the key parts of this. So takeaways. Try being a front-end developer. It's really fun because you can kind of do whatever you want. If you feel like making a bunch of icons one day, it's totally cool. If you feel like, getting a Tomcat up and running for your WordPress instance the next day, also totally cool. So it's a lot of fun. And if you're interested, please feel free to see me afterward and we'll chat. Also, designers, they're not scary, and everyone's on the same team, right? Designers are just your cool friends who know about feelings and art. They know what I want this app to feel like pizza means, or they can figure it out. And then the rough workflow that you probably want to follow, and people do typically follow. You go from plans to app map to wireframes to comps or visuals. And I think that's about it. So some time for questions. Yeah?
Could you say something about accessibility? For example, on your color wheel, I don't see the difference between blue and violet or green and orange.
Sure. There's a lot of different ways we can go with accessibility. So for the color instance, I've seen apps and various software actually have, colorblind mode, and there could be many subcategories of colorblind mode. And sometimes they just switch entirely to sort of like a black, white, and gray interface and take out all of the colors, because that's a fairly safe bet. Or they could do things like, rehone a shade of red to be more one way or another. Because again, there's a whole slew of types of color blindness. So it's rough to give like a hard and fast kind of rule. It's very subjective. But again, if this is a chief concern, keeping things black and white and gray is a very safe bet. There's also accessibility, like don't hard code don't hard code text into your app, because if you have accessibility turned on for people who might be visually impaired, it won't be able to interpret that hard-coded text, right? But if you keep it in a string, then it will. So part of it's good practice, and part of it's just sort of research. And again, this is all stuff that isn't hard and fast. It exists on a very subjective scale depending on what your needs are and what your consumers' needs are. So, you can definitely have a setting for that. That's an option. Or if you think that a large portion of your users will have that by default, you might want to design around that in the very first place. But there are certain things, like everyone's got a little inherent color sensitivity to like blue text on a red background. Like that's really hard for everyone to see. So that kind of stuff you want to shy away from, and just look at it and see if it makes your eyes bleed, and if it does, then don't do it. Move towards something a little more, muted for everyone's benefit. Yeah.
If you don't mind, excuse me, can you talk a little bit about like your journey and how you came across this front-end engineer position and your education?
Sure. So I actually went to Tech High on campus here. Yeah, I'm a techie. Nice. Ice weasels? Yeah. And in my earlier years, I was very interested in doing websites because a lot of our teachers gave us the option of making a website or doing a report, and I don't know, websites seemed like more fun at the time. So I've been doing websites since like middle school, something like that. And that really kind of got me going down that route. And then by the time I got to college, I had taken a couple of computer science classes, but at the time, for one reason or another, I just didn't feel like it was right for me. So I ended up switching over to my degrees are actually in evolutionary anthropology and linguistics, which I'm sure some of you know are super useful and employable. So as you might predict, I had a hard time finding a career for that after school was over. So I revisited my love of web design and that kind of engineering, and just started falling further and further down the rabbit hole and teaching myself new and different languages, and got a job as like a marketing person doing websites, and then from there went on to doing mobile app development, and then at the position I'm currently in, I do everything, like whatever needs doing. So it's not a very linear path, because again, there is no real major in front-end engineering, so you find a lot of people with very atypical backgrounds in this field. I think the background in anthropology really helped, so I can kind of tell how people think, and back to the information architecture thing, sort of what groupings make a little more sense to the human brain, because I studied that for many years. And I think that a lot of my colleagues who are in the same position came from just a pure computer science background and sort of taught themselves design on the side. So it's a ragtag group of folks from all walks of life doing front end. Yes?
What programming languages or markup languages do you find yourself spending the most time editing?
Right now, for better or for worse, it's CSS. Usually for worse. But most of my projects recently have been on the Xbox One, which uses WebStack, so the Microsoft flavor of JavaScript, HTML, CSS. And those are most of what I've been assigned to, but also, some Objective-C, some Swift fairly recently with our interns over the summer, Android, XML, sort of pure vanilla XML. I had to do a WordPress site pretty recently, so I learned a lot of PHP. Again, for better or for worse, probably for worse. So if it does something visually on the screen, that's what I gotta know. Anyone else? We're a couple minutes early, so.
No question.
Among these three steps that you mentioned in app development, what do you think is the biggest challenge out of the three, and where do people get stuck the most when you're developing an app?
The place where we have the most meetings and the most debates usually occurs during the information architecture stage, and just that's kind of honing in what everyone thinks that the app should do and what parts it should have. So that tends to be the biggest challenge, because some people might hear requirements and think completely differently than another person hearing the same requirements. So bringing everyone together, or even as an individual contributor, even solo, trying to figure out what needs to happen in order for the software to work the way you intend it, is usually kind of a rough patch. Sorry, I think you had a question.
Yeah. Back on the thing on accessibility a little bit. There's been work done to make things localized,
Sure.
from a text perspective. Are there things being done in the UX world for localized UXs, or does one user experience rule them all? I mean, is it?
Oh.
And can you build one thing and then somehow put a different face on it to service different countries and stuff like that?
Sure. So you can absolutely do that. You can, there are a variety of ways that we don't have to discuss necessarily of figuring out where a user is roughly. But there's a lot of work being done for that. Like, for instance, in Japan, the buttons on a PlayStation for circle and square, which we usually think of square as select and circle as back, are reversed. Because square to them means no, right? So if you're using a Japanese PlayStation, you have to completely flip those buttons in your mind. So there's stuff like that. There are a lot of quirks depending on your country as well. So I believe in some Mediterranean countries, stoplights are red and blue and not red and green. So if you design an interface that uses a lot of blue and you plan to launch it in Turkey or Greece or something like that, you might need to revisit the use of blue, again, to kind of conform to the same thing like we were saying with stoplights. So it again, very, very subjective. That's a great question. Okay, I think we're about out of time.
If I'm not going over, I just have one more question. In terms of feedback, what are the most successful ways to get feedback as a student developing an app?
Like I said, just ask everyone you know. Like, we have this concept in social sciences called an ethnography, where you just kind of take cross-sections of populations, right? So we can do ethnographic studies as far as user research goes as well. So you can ask everyone from your grandfather to your baby niece, or, just a variety of students around campus or something like that, to use your app and use that feedback to identify the real pain points in what you've done.
Are there specific techniques that your company uses to get feedback, or?
We're usually on quite a deadline, so we tend to elicit feedback from coworkers. So that's kind of part of our corporate culture, is just being able to give good feedback, as if we weren't in the software industry, and as we weren't friends with all the other people developing the app. So,
Just trying to find things to ask you about for like your speech, but the blog on your website seems to be down.
oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Just so you know.
You guys probably /dotted it. I'm kidding. I'll check after that, but I appreciate the.
I don't think that's your part, but I do think that, yeah. I just wanted to read about some of your projects, Xbox. Like, you guys do HBO Go, right?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
We've done a lot of other ones too. A lot of them I can't talk about, but some of them we can. So. Cool. I think that officially puts us over. So appreciate everyone's time. So.